now about time then to sort of introduce the panelists to the full sort of Q&A session, and have a chance now to ask you questions that have been coming in. Have a look. I think quite a few of these have been answered by text typing as well, but I will also sort of go through those and ask them to you, and you can elaborate on any of those points as well. There was a question there for Thomas that was asked earlier, and you did answer it, but so say, why do archaeologists use different dating symbols? Far away, Thomas.
Yeah, I'll answer that one. So essentially, the BP is before present. So sometimes people will just basically work out how much time has passed since the date. Like I mentioned, it's not so much of an issue for sites that are, thousands of years old, or even, potentially millions. That's fine. It's just when you get to these sort of closer dates, then you might have to re-amend your dates every so often, so it's accurate. Or you have to check when, for example, if you're looking at a journal article and it says, the date and then BP, you'd have to work out when was the article published to work out the exact time. So it's more for, I guess it's more of an issue when you come to like sites with exact dates, but not so much for ones where there's estimates. And then with the BC AD, that's just to go with the sort of Christian calendar, first century before Christ or whatever. So that's basically the difference. So I guess it doesn't really, there's no right or wrong. It's just preference, I guess. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that sounds good. You also answered in the text, Thomas, they answered very well a question, so I just wanted to raise it sort of live, as might help other people might be thinking of it. As Gordon's asked, what was the panel's opinion on rebuilding historical sites ruins? Has that been done at I was going to try and pronounce it.
That's it. Very good. Very good. So at Panellist, it's an interesting case. I think the site was extensively excavated, so we had a lot of information. We knew where the post holes were for that site. Well, when I say we, I mean I actually wasn't involved with the reconstruction, so I'm talking about us as a National Park Authority and partners. So in that case, we had a lot of evidence, but it's worth remembering with that site, it's very much experimental archaeology. So we don't have all the information. So we're speculating about potential ways that site was constructed. So we're using the best evidence. So I think generally, you'd probably only, do those reconstructions when you have good evidence, because to some extent, it goes back to what I mentioned in the talk. The more evidence you have, the more you can build a clearer picture, but the less you have, the more difficult it is. Plus, a lot of these sites, they're finite. So once we amend them or we change them, that evidence is then gone. We can't put it back. And plus, I think I mentioned that these days we have technology. So some of the stuff that we've done, and we're in the process of doing it to another site, is doing these kind of virtual digital reconstructions. So these days you can do that, and as your evidence gets stronger or better or more informed, you can then amend that. Whereas if you're doing a reconstruction physically, it would make it then very difficult. Then you'd have to completely rebuild the site. But I think from an engagement point of view, Panellist is brilliant because it gets people thinking about potentially how roundhouses were constructed. So I hope that kind of answers the question in a long-winded way.
Okay, that's very helpful, Thomas. So I wondered if John or Sid have anything they'd like to add to that question, or
No, I think Thomas has done that one justice.
Yeah. Brilliant. Having a look here. One for John, I think. Is the newly discovered composition of lichens true for all lichens or just some?
Oh, I think it's supposedly true for all of them. One thing that is quite interesting, worldwide there's 28,000 species of lichen, and Britain there's about 1,900 and 450 odd that are coastal. Every single lichen is a different species of fungus, but worldwide there are only 100 algal species that lichenize fungi to make them lichens. So given that most of the algae and or cyanobacteria are almost global, then it would make sense to suggest that the composition of lichens is going to be similarly complicated wherever you would look for them.
Thank you, John. And another question that's come in after your presentation is whether, do we have an overview of intertidal biodiversity? Is there an area that is improving, or is it an area of concern?
Oh, blimey, we've got another half an hour. I do monitoring every year on Skoma intertidal rocks, an area up in Cardigan and Pembrokeshire shores as well. And in general terms, things are fairly stable. But one thing I did find, I did a survey in Milford Haven Waterway this year, is that there do seem to be an increasing number of what are called invasive or non-alien species coming in. Quite often seaweeds, but things like sea squirts and sea mats and so on as well. So there are changes. I suppose community-wide things are reasonably stable, but there are beginning to be subtle differences in little seaweeds and things like that. And as I say, with these invasive species. So it's stable but changing, if that makes any sense at all. I think we need to be concerned because as seawater rises, that's going to affect things big time. And as humans gobble up more and more habitat, that's going to affect things big time. But certainly at present, and over the shores that I've looked at for the last 20 odd, 30 odd years, the changes aren't big yet. That's the short version.
Great, thank you. And I know you've been answering via typing, Sid, but so it might, the answer live would maybe helpful to other attendees as well. Somebody asked whether the Coldy quarry was for limestone.
Yeah, all the quarries on Coldy were for limestone all along the north coast of the island, and on St Margaret's very heavily quarried as well. The south side is in old red sandstone and it's very exposed, so sailing vessels wouldn't be able to moor there safely to take on the cargoes.
And John has said that Aberivie, the quarry, flooded out quarry at Aberivie is roughly 30 metres. Do the geologists concur, or pretty far down, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a very, very deep, dark and frightening dive. And I think it was at least 25, and I think it was coming up to 30 metres.
Yeah, if you look in the quarry, above water, you can see the levels. The typical height of each rock face, you can still see those levels at the back of the quarry. So imagine it's going to be at least that depth. And as John suggested, possibly a bit more, as they were trying to get some of the best slate resource, and they were pumping water at the same time to keep it dry. So they would have tried to get as much out of there as possible.
And there's two similar questions around the Sea Empress oil spill, of whether evidence still remains on the shore of the Sea Empress oil spill.
I can go down to one shore that I know very, very well, behind one little rock, and I can still find some sea empress oil. It's hard, black and bituminous now, but it's still there. But in very brief terms, it's so many variables here. I looked at Olympic population, and the limpet population in terms of the number of the limpets and the age structure seemed to return to normal in about 2 years. Because the oil hit in February, it wiped out 90% of barnacles on the shore, but most barnacles settled from the plankton on the shore in spring, so that by July, August of that year, you probably had as many barnacles as you should have, because they'd settled from the plankton after the oil had gone, but the age structure was completely different. 2 years after, seaweed's probably back to normal. The perceived wisdom is that if you've got a shore that's open to big waves, it will self-clean within about 2 years. If it's a sheltered shore, it'll self-clean within about 6 to 8 years. If it's a salt marsh, it'll take 20 years to recover, roughly, but it depends on the type of oil and other things as well.
Generally, when it's cleaned, in inverted commas, off the shore, it's going somewhere else. I mean, there are components which are biodegrading, but there are also components which aren't biodegradable, and they will go to where the muddy sinks are. Those components will adsorb onto clay particles and end up in the muddier parts of the, say for example, the waterway. They'll be in the estuary muds, in the intertidal muds, and offshore some of those components will have gone down to deeper water. So if you want to see how long it takes things to biodegrade, if you go down below Llanreath, the Pembroke Dock, you can still see oil that was released from the tanks when the tanks were bombed in the Second World War. And if you stick something sharp into those tarry lumps, there's still oil present at the base of those tarry lumps. So I think that the sea impress was, apart from the fact that it happened in the first place, it was rather fortunate that it was most of it was light crude oil, and it came ashore. Most of it came ashore on a high tide, so there was plenty of time for cleaning, although some of that cleaning was probably ill-advised in terms of what was done. So I don't think you should take the sea empress as an example of where, you know, everything goes back to normal. It's certainly, you don't want to be having another incident like that. It might not be so fortunate in the second time around.
As you all said, well, there, Sid, there was a question for you regarding if there was any specific abandoned quarry sites which could be viably restored for future use.
Yeah, definitely. Unless the geological resource was worked out completely, then those quarries could be looked at again. As long as the resource hasn't also been sterilized, in inverted commas, by building developments or other things like, say for example, solar farms are now sterilizing some of the potential resources, and there's a predisposition against quarrying within the national park, but under exceptional circumstances. And some of the circumstances we're about to face are going to be exceptional. There might be some flexibility there. And then there are plenty of sites outside of the national park as well, which are potential sites, but it takes a very long time to do the investigations required and get the planning permissions for something. So you're looking at, unless a lot of people get involved, at least 10 years before you have a new site available.
Is there, so I was thinking along these lines of when sites are running now, is there decommissioning processes that have to write in sort of into plans to favour wildlife when the site is decommissioned, or is the site?
Yeah, most quarries will have a restoration plan. Again, in the past, I think that's been rather ill-advised in terms of just restoring it to what was there before, which is yet more fields which are going to be relatively low biodiversity. Whereas if you just walk away and lock the gate, you end up with biodiversity, as John has been explaining. Things will take matters into their own hands and create something unusual in terms of biodiversity. So those old quarries are very rich for lichens and mosses and insects, and then that goes up the whole food chain. Really, you've got birds of prey on the crags, nesting on the crags. You've got newts and things in the ponds. You've got snakes. Yeah, I mean, it's most of those places are very interesting to biologists, I would think, not only to geologists, going back and look, see what was going on there.
Yeah. One here, Robert was interested in your comment about the environmental value of reassessing useful extraction of metals from UK deposits. Are there any rare earth metals worth extracting in Wales? That's a big question.
Metalliferous minerals weren't very common in the first place, and those that were available were worked with the technology which was available at that time. I guess you could reevaluate looking at the technology that you've got now. I think my comment was mainly on more sort of the ordinary things like building stone and crushed stone, rather than specialist things. But yeah, there has been investigation of some of the rocks in north-east Pembrokeshire and most of mid Wales for rare earth elements, but it's the size of the extraction that would be required, I think, would be unacceptable to most people.
And where can, so Joe's asked, where can I find more information on the history of the use of the Ddiwydiannol River? Yes, that's open to all panelists, really. I know Thomas has provided some useful links, the archaeological side of things. Are there any other, where there are gems of wisdom about the history of the river?
I think you have to, it's widely scattered. It's not, I mean, Tomos has given us some great places to start looking. But then there's a lot of stuff which is kind of community, on community websites, in leaflets, etc. And then there's some of which is still, how can I describe it? You know, it's just folk memory still surviving of some of it, passed on through generations. But it will be, we're losing that quite quickly now. So yeah, it needs to be assembled. And I guess that's, Thomas will say how his volunteer groups are getting on with that task of adding to the records while he still can.
Yeah, just adding, so the work of our heritage volunteers, they basically, they monitor the scheduled monuments in the national park area. So I think there's about just under 150 of them. So some of them will include the industrial sites as well. And that's more for us to work out a way to, you know, sustainably manage those sites. I think one other area I think I didn't mention, particularly looking into the Ddiwydiannol River, would be the archives. The local archives might have some useful information. And the Ddiwydiannol River, it's really interesting, the history, particularly in the Middle Ages, how important that area was, and it's one of the reasons that we see places like Haverfordwest becoming quite prosperous as a result. So yeah, there's loads of potential areas you can look at, the databases which I posted in the chat, and also you can also use some of the local sources. But I think Sid's right, there'll be lots of communities that will have that information as well. So it's a bit of a challenge really to find a way to access it, because it's not all in one place. But yeah, there's plenty of resources out there.
What are local history groups, Facebook groups? I wonder if is that more of a searching Facebook job?
It might be. It might be a case of looking on Facebook, but you'll also. I'm trying to think of any organisation. So one organisation in Pembrokeshire that might be useful is Planed, if you've come across it. And they liaise with a lot of the community and local history groups. So they might be one to consider as well. I know that we support them, but they've got a Pembrokeshire Heritage Forum. So they will have a certain list of communities and societies. So that might be worth contacting Planed.
Thank you. As a question come up for yourself. Still not quite sure what the distinction is between archaeology and history. Any more ideas on this?
Well, this is I saw this one and I kind of smiled a bit, because it's a really good question. Essentially, I suppose the simplified version would be that history relates to the period in time when we have written or documentary evidence. Historians, they deal specifically with documents, whereas archaeology is about the physical traces. So archaeology is, I suppose, a broader discipline, but what you sometimes find is you find prehistory as a description. So that essentially archaeology does include historical evidence, so it's those documentary sources. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thank you. Yeah, it's done. That seems to be the last of the open questions. There's a few minutes if anyone does have any that come to their mind now. Please do type them in. Just want to take this opportunity to ask each of you if you had any closing thoughts that you'd like to sort of one point to pass out to attendees now, if there's anything extra you'd like to add. Please, I did have a silly question for Sid of asking whether you have a favourite stove and why.
Oh, that's a good one. A favourite stone. Well, I quite like some of our pebble beaches have far travel stones, so I quite like it when I find agates from the Midland Valley of Scotland that have been brought down by the ice sheets. I also like to see Ailsa Craig microgranite from the Firth of Clyde. So tend to enjoy the exotic ones that are far travelled without me having to go to Scotland to find them. So we do have nice pebble beaches where you can see a very wide variety of rocks, not just local ones.
And I was going to ask Thomas if people's archaeology interest has been sparked by this morning. Whether if you were new to archaeology, where in Pembrokeshire, where would be the first place you would go? What site would you visit?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. There's so many sites which you've seen in all. I think all talks have kind of touched upon different sites and things. I guess I suppose some interesting places to start would be maybe places like Castellhenllys or Carew Castle, because you've got, particularly with Castellhenllys, you've got the reconstructions there. But really, it would depend on what period people are interested in. So I would probably recommend have a look online, have a look at some of the resources, and see what area interests you. When I started out in archaeology, I think medieval was sort of my area of interest. But the more I've been in Pembrokeshire, the more I'm kind of drawn to prehistory. So I'm drawn to those Neolithic sites. So yeah, it really just depends on what period is kind of people's interest.
Thank you, Thomas. And I was going to ask John, because they lichens, they're very feel they're not nice and fluffy, are they? They're not the wildlife that we sort of imagine in our heads as straight away. Whether there's a site in Pembrokeshire where you find the most lichens, where would you head to, where you would go and think, wow, lichens galore?
I think one of the really good places, maybe the Gwaun Valley or Intertidal or Pengethley, where you get these beautiful coverings all over the old trees, especially on a misty morning, because they can be little wet usneas and things like that. It's just dripping with lichens. Otherwise, if you're on Skomer or some of the main headlands, St David's Head is good actually, is to just enjoy the carpet of lichens all over the exposed rocks. Lichens will grow where it's a bit too sort of salt sprayed for higher plants, but maybe not wet enough for marine organisms. So big exposed headlands like St David's with big splash and spray zones, you get lovely carpets of lichens all over the rock. So that'd be another good place to look.
Thank you very much for that. I want to say thank you very much for the speakers today. I will share my screen once more with everybody. I was going to, so speakers are happy to, you can mute and unvideo yourselves now, who can stand down. Thank you very much for input. I was just going to come to feedback for this event. It'd be great, so we do consider our feedback to look at when we develop events in the future. So please, can you, great, you can use your phone to scan the QR code that's up on the screen, which should take you straight up to the feedback form, or the link is there, which is not that very memorable, sorry, but yeah, so the QR code is the better way to go, and I will send an email out to you with the link in also. And just there is more in the near future. We have, you want to join us for more, we've got the Welsh Marine Wildlife, which is an all Wales environmental event later this week, happening on Thursday evening. And then later in the month, we have a Marine Code event, which will be focusing on coastal invertebrates. So please do check those two out. It'd be great to see you attend. And I just want to say the final thank yous, and thank you for joining us, and thank you very much to our panelists for some great presentations and well answered questions. Thank you very much.